The EU, with its growing economic clout, expanding defense budgets, and deepening diplomatic ties, seems in line to step up to the world stage as a major geopolitical player. Despite these advances, Europe's voice often feels muted, its actions fragmented, and its influence mostly overshadowed by powers beyond its borders. And this paradox is nowhere as clear as with the current conflict in Ukraine, a crisis that has shaken the continent's sense of security to its core. While the EU grapples with internal divisions and debates over how to respond effectively, Trump and Putin's meeting exposes Europe's sidelines role, underscoring a painful truth, and that being today's topic. Europe's geopolitical potential remains unrealized, and its future is still too often determined by others. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to our Diplomacy, this podcast that delves into the international relations and geopolitical latest developments. Today, we dive into a key, crucial question. Can the EU match its growing political toolkit with the will to act decisively and claim its place as a true geopolitical actor? This is quite the question, and in order to answer, I'm joined today by my fellow co-host and fellow EU Bubble partner, Armis Sinkem. Armis, hello once again. How's it going, and how do you see today's topic?
Hi, Fabio. Excited to be joining you today. And like you said, the EU is really at crossroads right now, caught between ambition and reality, trying to find its footing in a world where power dynamics are shifting fast. And if you've been following us, dear listeners, you know that we've explored some of these themes in a recent episode that was called The New Age of Great Power Competition, Deals and Dominance. So make sure to follow us on social media to stay up to date on those episodes. Now back to today's question. We will break it down into three parts. First, we will look at Europe's evolving defense and economic posture, how investments and strategies are reshaping the continent's capabilities. In section 2, we'll dive into the political gaps and national divides that continue to challenge a unified EU response. And then finally, in the third section, we'll explore how the EU fits into the broader changing world order and what that means for its future as a geopolitical actor. So, Fabio, we've got plenty to unpack. Let's get started. To start off this first section on the EU's posture, I wanted to talk about numbers. These numbers highlight how immensely powerful the European Union is, at least in theory. The two most crucial metrics to measure power are the economy and the military. Now, first, let's start with the economy. The EU has 5% of the world's population, but its GDP share is 15% of the world's GDP. That's around the same share of China. The EU member states, going to the military side of things, spent 300 billion euros on defense last year. And now it depends on which source you choose, but that's somewhere in the ballpark of what Russia and China spent on their defense. The EU's militaries employ 2 million people of active personnel. That's more than the US and Russia, and it's around the size of China's military. And then consider the EU's alliance with the US. Of course, you have NATO here, by far the most powerful military alliance in the entire world. Even if China and Russia suddenly came together and formed a military alliance, which is not the case right now and which we don't expect to happen in the future, NATO would still be much more powerful. And economically, it's a powerful alliance as well. The US and EU represent 40% of the world's GDP, with less than 10% of the world's population. And then add on to that the powerful allies of the West: Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and the UK. Add all those Western states up and you have a GDP share that is higher than 50%. So even though Europe and the European Union have a small population. Militarily and economically, it's punching way above its weight.
It's quite paradoxical, right? Because as you've said, Europe has an immense economic size and military potential, but generally the EU is not widely seen as this traditional superpower. And in a nutshell, I would say that it's mostly because it lacks the unified hard power capabilities and the political cohesion that characterizes countries and armies such as the one that the United States or China have. But let me break that thought into three main points. If we firstly talk about the political dimension, I would say that one of the main reasons of this EU's limited global power projection, it's mostly its internal political disunity. And let me put an example in there. When we talk about the European Council, which is one of the institutions where the EU leaders and these member states often meet and try to reach consensus, this is frequently obstructed because there is not a unified posture, right? We're talking about 27 different member states with 27 different perspectives on world affairs. So I believe that this fragmentation really makes it really difficult to coordinate a common foreign policy or defense strategy. The EU still is a great global actor, but this really makes things to take a bit longer than maybe they take in other capitals such as Washington, Kiev, Moscow, just to give you some examples. Then militarily, as a second point, I would say that the EU suffers from fragmentation and inefficiencies. You talk about this great and big defense industry, and that's the case, but I think that it's still really redundant and not as integrated as we'd like. And let's not forget that 80% of Europe's defense procurement still coming from outside of the continent, mostly from the US. So the EU is openly and actively trying to address this by standardizing procurement rules, by promoting joint projects, through new mechanisms that the EU and the Commission are trying to put forward, and try to encourage member states to align their defense capabilities a bit more. So progress is being made there, Miss, but of course that a fully European defense industry is still a lot of work in progress.
Just to quickly interrupt on the military part, the reason why it's so hard to develop this unified military is that, among other reasons, each country has its own military industrial complex. In some countries, it's very neglectable. In Luxembourg, perhaps non-existent. But especially the major member states, they have their military industries. And there's a lot of jobs tied to them. Now, if you suddenly came up with a unified European military, you would realize some of those factories are probably not needed anymore. Others need to be bigger. And suddenly one member state would win, the other would lose. And this would be very hard to sell in the member states politically. So these are just some of the headaches that heads of state in Europe encounter, and that is avoiding them from further integrating militarily. But Fabio, on to your third point.
I think it's a perfect bridge, Armis, because I think that the third point reflects on this, but maybe more on the conventional and nuclear deterrence perspective. The European continent, the European Union has historically relied heavily on the American defense nuclear deterrence, especially in areas such as air defense, logistics, and nuclear protection. So when we're talking about great powers, great armies, the nuclear aspect comes in there, right? So this burden shifting, of course, that has allowed European countries to prioritize other things such as social spending, but it has left these huge capability gaps that persist to today. I mean, we know that France and UK are global powers that have their own arsenals, but a unified European nuclear force, I think, still remains politically and practically still in the long run. So I think that the EU is starting to explore options, but as of now, I think that these 3 points still limit the unified global stance of the EU. So in summary, Aramis, I think that it's not just about spending more money, because the EU has the money, it has the capabilities, but it's missing this political unity, right? Which I believe is the real currency of power in this sense. But Hermes, we're starting to talk about this other crucial actor for global politics, for the alliance that it shares with the EU, which is the United States. We know that the transatlantic relation has not been in its best of shapes these last years. So what's your stance on this? How do you see it? And do you think that the EU can truly depend on this partnership moving forward?
Yeah, some of our listeners may have been surprised about me earlier talking about the EU-US alliance, because with all those bad news that we've recently heard coming out of the White House, one may say there is no more alliance between Europe and the US. And while I, of course, fully admit that US EU relations are at a historic low, I think there are still a few fundamentals that hold these partners together and that will hold them together in the future. That the relationship may change, but these fundamentals ultimately prevent them from really diverging into something else, because the costs of not working together would just be too high. And I want to talk about two big factors here, Fabio. The first one is the economy. The EU is economically too important to be abandoned by the US. The US needs the products from Europe to run its economy. And on the other hand, it needs the European Union as an export destination to sell all those goods. We always talk about the Harley Davidsons, the whiskeys and whatnot. In other words, one could say the US economy is smaller and less efficient without the EU. And the other thing is, militarily, both the EU and the US face the same issue, which is China and Russia in their respective regions trying to change the overall geopolitical dynamics, potentially attacking other territories. And this could create massive economic damage. Both the EU and the US need to avoid that at all costs. To give you just one example here, people talk about this prospect of China potentially attacking Taiwan. In Taiwan, there's this huge chip factory which makes these semiconductors for the entire world. If that factory alone would shut down, it would trigger an economic crisis equivalent to the 2008 financial crisis. Now, that's just one factory. That's not even the entire Taiwanese economy. And then imagine what would happen if, following a Taiwanese invasion, the West would trigger sanctions against China. The West asks Western companies to move out of China. It would be economically an immense headache. It would cost wealth that is just beyond our imagination. The political upheaval would be insane. And for Russia, we also have these kinds of threats. It attacked Georgia, it attacked Ukraine, of course, and it could potentially also extend those attacks if it sees that Europe is weak. We could talk about Moldova here, we could talk about the Baltics and other regions. So the EU and US, they will want to avoid this, and to avoid this, it's best to be working together. It's just the most efficient means.
I couldn't agree more, Amis. I think that despite all this criticism, the rhetoric that comes from the White House, this transatlantic relation is mutually beneficial. It allows both sides of the Atlantic to share the defense burdens. And I have the feeling like now with this awakening of European defense, it can allow the US to actually finally focus on this theater that you're mentioning, which is Asia. Right, so I think that this could really fulfill this this decade-old strategic objective of pivoting towards Asia. But I have the feeling that for this division of labor to actually work, I think it's crucial now more than ever for the Trump administration not to abandon its European allies in the face of the negotiations in Ukraine. I think that Trump needs to realize that ensuring Europe to play its role in the region and not to be vulnerable to these potential attacks that you're mentioning from Russia is super important for this to actually happen. However, Hermes, I feel that the alliance is truly undergoing a major period of transformation where Europe can no longer fully trust the US leadership, and it's starting to look for its own path. But that's the military angle, Hermes. I think that economically wise, we can also have a lot of things to discuss.
Yes. First, maybe let's talk about the EU-US trade relations. That's another interesting issue. Trump has for a long time been complaining that there's a trade deficit between the EU and the US. Now there's this new EU-US trade deal. It was a big priority I think, for the White House to get this trade deal done because the EU is so important for the US. Now they have it, and it may be a door opener for better relations between the EU and the US. We already see this playing out during the current negotiations that will soon take place. We're recording this ahead of the Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump. Beforehand, Trump has now consulted European leaders on his position during the negotiations. This is something he hasn't done before. So we can already see that relations are improving. What we could read as Trump's playbook is that first he tried to bring out the hammer, try to negotiate better conditions for the US. But now, as he wants to implement his geopolitical agenda in the second presidential terms, he's really trying to get the EU back on his side again, even though I think there's absolutely no chance that the EU-US relations can be the same again. The trust between the two continents has been shattered, and the relations will have certainly suffered under this, but some form of cooperation will continue. Now, let's talk about competitiveness. This is a big buzzword in Brussels. Fabio and I, we're working here and we hear it every single day. It's the big concern that everyone has. So what's this all about? Europe has a great economy, but there's a big fear. And that is that the European companies are not able to compete on global markets. Now, this has two big reasons, as conventional wisdom among European policymakers says, which is reason number one, bureaucracy. There's just too many rules in Europe and it's hard to navigate through them. So the EU is trying to simplify its policy. And the second reason is energy costs. The energy costs in Europe are twice as high or more than twice as high actually, compared to the US and China. And there's many energy-intensive industries in Europe, and they struggle to compete under those conditions. Now, the EU, it's tackling exactly those two issues. It's trying to simplify various EU laws that affect the economy, and it has launched a flagship clean industrial deal. And it's trying to achieve two things, this clean industrial deal. First, lower energy prices, and second, make them more reliable by going with domestic energy. Right now, the EU is massively dependent on foreign imports. Last year, it spent 400 billion euros on fossil fuel imports. Now there's enough sun, wind, and other sources of energy in Europe to supply the energy of the continent multiple times. You just need to build the respective power plants. And this is what the EU is trying to do with the clean industrial deal. So on the supply side, step up European production. And also on the demand side, you need to electrify, you need to deploy other technologies so the industries can switch from fossil fuel consumption to electricity and other sources.
Yes, Armis, and I think that another constraint that limits a growth in the EU, it's the aging of its population, the aging of its working population, the upskilling, right? When we talk about competitive in a global market, we need to remember that the average age of workers here is decreasing, and that brings a lot of questions and dilemmas as well. Who is going to pay for those pensions in the future? How are we going to be able to stay competitive if there's just not enough people to work in the manufacture, right? So those are other things that the EU is trying to address with its new mechanisms and the new budget. And let's not forget as well that the EU is increasingly seen as a regulatory superpower that tries to set standards that affect global markets, right? So there's still a lot of vulnerabilities, especially now that we talk about tariffs, because even though there is a deal with the US, there's still going to be certain tariffs to certain EU products. It's not going to be as tough as it's going to be for other countries, but they're still going to hurt certain sectors. And we have overcapacity in manufacturing coming from economies such as China. And finally, I think that we should mention that in this global panorama, there has been a reapproachment between the EU and the UK, which are trying to make efforts to ease trade frictions and strengthen ties, not just commercially, but as well militarily, when we talk about the context of the Ukrainian situation as well. So, Armis, I think that overall, we are starting to talk about how the EU is trying to address its challenges. And again, I think that we can see that it has the capabilities, it has the tools, it has the economy, but it's still missing what we said in the first parts of this episode. Where is this political power, right? And there's a lot of constraints in there.
Yes, and we really see this playing out with those initiatives that I've just mentioned. The Clean Industrial Deal, it's all nice, it's very good, but the overall budget is that the EU is proposing to implement this will not be enough to actually make this change from importing all your energy to getting all your energy domestically. You need the support of the member states here, or you need to allow the members, or the member states need to allow the European Union to take on more debt or to take its own taxes. But the EU needs some revenue stream to get this going. And if in the end the member states don't comply here, then it will be very hard. The same discussion is now with the EU budget. The EU just proposed its next budget, and it's just slightly bigger than the last budget that it had, even though the global challenges that are facing Europe have grown tremendously. And now we see all the EU states already blocking this and saying, no, we don't want to spend more. There's currently all these issues with austerity, with debt, etc. So with this kind of mindset from the member states, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to tackle all these challenges at a European level. Then one could say, yeah, maybe they can tackle it at a national level. But if you ask any analyst, I mean, most of them will agree that taking on China and the US on the member state level, even if we think of France and Germany, that's just not feasible. It's only possible if you take the combined power that I've mentioned at the start of this episode.
That's a great reflection, Armis, and I think that it bridges perfectly to the next block we want to discuss, which is this heart of the matter, right? The political gaps and the national divides that continue to shape and sometimes even constrain the EU's ability to act as a unified global power. So let's go more in depth and talk about these political dynamics in more detail in the next block.
To understand why the EU is not able to use its power, we will now have a look at its institutional design. Unlike the US or Russia, the EU does not have a powerful president that can just take actions on his or her own. EU decision-making is made by three bodies: the Commission, which we could call the EU executive branch. In the case of the US, that would be the President, the White House. Next to this, we have the legislative branch, which is the European Parliament in this case. Comparison to the US, it's like the House of Representatives, the lower house. And then we have the equivalent to the US Senate, which is the European Council, which is composed of the heads of state or governments from each member states. Fabio was talking about it earlier, that it blocks actions that the EU wants to take. And then, and this is where it's the usual EU thing where things get complicated, there's also the Council of the European Union. So not only the European Council, but also the Council of the European Union. It's again like a Senate. It's again, each member state has one seat, and again, they veto things. But this time it's with ministers, and it's more policy oriented, focused on each policy section. And then, for example, you have the foreign ministers of the European Union meeting in the Council of the European Union, and then they try to agree on their foreign policy. And here, a very crucial thing is they need a unanimous vote to take action. And that's very hard on EU level. So out of all the things I've just mentioned, if you want to remember just one thing, just think of member states that are able to block decision-making as part of the legislative branch, making the executive branch, the Commission, less powerful because the Commission president, which is Ursula von der Leyen, she can only change laws with the approval of the Council and the Parliament. Now, to continue our comparison with the US, imagine Donald Trump could only take action with the approval of the Congress and of each US state. He would be much less powerful, and his actions would be less concrete, less swift, and rather the result of negotiations between various actors. But that's also the beauty of EU policy. It's usually not extreme or erratic, but the result of a long process where the opinion of several stakeholders has been accounted for. In your opinion, how would you rank the most powerful politicians in this policy madness that I've just tried to explain here?
Oof, that's not a small task, Armis. As you've mentioned, European politics and the power the leaders have, it's really diluted across the board. And I really like that comparison with the US political system. Here in Brussels, we get so confused with the different institutions and they have really similar names. But it's true that each one of these institutions play different roles. But if we think about leaders, specific people, we need to think about formal influence and political weight. So in my list, Hermes, I had to say, if I had to list 5 top leaders, I think that overall none of them have as much consolidated power as in other countries in other regions. But I would have to say that the first one on my list, at least from my point of view, and please, if you think otherwise, go for it. But I would say that the European Commission's president, von der Leyen, would be at the top of my list. And let me explain myself. I think that despite the limitations that you've mentioned, I think that she plays a crucial role as the head of the EU's executive branch. Let's remember that the Commission president plays this super important role in setting the policy agenda and representing the EU as a whole on the global stage. Von der Leyen has notably extended and consolidated her influence within the institutions, which is important to mention. And I have the feeling that with Macron and the Chancellor of Germany, the new Chancellor, Merz, facing certain domestic political challenges, this allows the President of the Commission to have even more authority. Let's remember as well that the Commission has the exclusive authority over the EU single market, which means that for trade discussions, it is the EU institution, it is the EU Commission dealing with the other partners. And I think that now, in the sense of transactional policymaking, as Trump sees it, the Commission plays a big role. So that would be my first leader. Second, I would say German's Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. Let's remember that Germany is Europe's largest economy. It has a strong weight in that sense. And I have the feeling like lately Germany has awakened as well from that military dream, putting more focus on strengthening its defense. So I think that historically Germany has had a strong role in the EU, and I feel like it's still the case. Third, I would say French President Macron as well. A lot of geopolitical ambitions, military capabilities, nuclear as well. But I think that Macron has faced a lot of constraints lately, a lot of political challenges that have somewhat limited its influence across Europe. But I still that he still remains a good rapport with international figures such as Donald Trump, once again. And really quickly, in the fourth place, I would say Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk plays a big role as well. Poland is growing a lot in both military and economic capabilities. It's in the border with Russia, so it's as well. The geopolitical focus, I think, is shifting as well to the east. And fifth, even though it's not it's not anymore an EU politician, I would say that Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, still plays a big European stance, even in the post-Brexit panorama, keeping the UK closely aligned to the EU in security and trade. I think that it still makes him a big player, right? And of course, this soft Brexit stance also is playing a big role. So, Armis, I would say those would be my 5 top powerful politicians in the European stage. What's your perspective?
There will be lots of people disagreeing with Ursula von der Leyen being the most powerful out of those 5. But I really want to reinforce that point on the European Union leaders being powerful, because at the end of the day, a very large portion of all the laws that you see in the EU are coming from the European Union. In fact, the EU has passed much more laws than the US Congress and White House. So that's just showing that at the end of the day, it has a lot of power. Those laws are the result of a long process, but those laws are initiated by the European Commission. And again, Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Commission. And then during the negotiation process, you have the European Parliament and the European Commission that have a large say over how those laws play out. And it's not for every policy area that you need a majority vote, that you need a unanimous vote. Sometimes there's also a majority that is sufficient to pass a law, a majority in the council. Then we even have some areas where the EU has exclusive competence. And we've seen that recently play out during the EU-US trade deal. That was negotiated between a team of Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission with the White House. And so we recently had the deal concluded, finally being negotiated. And Trump traveled to Scotland and presented it there together with Ursula von der Leyen. And he sat there together with her, even though he previously said that the European Union was just established to screw the United States. So the fact that he has to sit down with the leader of the European Union and negotiate this shows how powerful the EU is. And because of my point of the EU being powerful, I want to mention one more actor, which is often forgotten. He's under the radar, especially outside of Brussels. I'm speaking of the leader of the European People's Party, Mr. Manfred Weber. This guy is the head of the largest party in the European Parliament. This party is not so much tied to, it's theoretically the same party as the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, but it can still navigate relatively freely in the European Parliament, looking for majorities on the respective policy issues. So Manfred Weber, he can try to get majorities with the left parties in the European Parliament. He can try to get majorities with the right parties in the European Parliament. And here, based on this, he has a lot of power. So whenever there's this negotiation process, whenever they pass a new law, this guy can change a lot. Because without the European People's Party that he leads, you don't get any law in the European Union. Because for the left, the right parties are not really acceptable, and the other way around. The kingmaker is the European People's Party, and that's why Manfred Weber is so powerful.
Yeah, Aramis, we often forget about that king player, that kingmaker in the parliament, which is crucial for EU politics. It's true that people outside the EU bubble might not even know of his existence until today, but it's true that he plays a crucial part of the game. But Aramis, when we take the zoom a little bit out of the question and we talk about the shifting of power, which different unions or alliances, smaller alliances within the EU, how would you say they play a role in EU politics as a role? I mean, we mentioned that the Eastern countries are getting more influence, but do you think this trend can be replicated in other areas, other countries of the continent?
So I talked about those three actors that shape EU decision-making: the Parliament, the Commission, and then thirdly, we have the Council. The Council is what consists of the member states, where they can directly impact EU policy making. And I also mentioned how in the Council, you often need a unanimous vote, but in even more instances, a majority, a so-called qualified majority or a simple majority is enough. And to form those majorities, we have different alliances in the European Union, which are often formed between the member states so they can push through their policy together. One notable alliance are the Frugal Five. These are countries in the EU that are rather reluctant to step up the spending. I mentioned how some countries resist to increasing the EU budget, or other countries that resist to taking on common debt with the EU. Those countries are usually the Frugal Five, and others. So these are Austria, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, Finland. Next to this, we have the eastern states like Poland, Hungary, the Baltics. Now, this Eastern Alliance is usually very vocal about taking a more confident posture against Russia. And it receives a pushback from two other member states, which are Hungary and Slovakia, especially relevant during the unanimous votes. Hungary is often blocking action that could potentially harm Russia. Then, the most powerful player that I would finally like to mention here is the Franco-German axis. So often, when you have the process of EU policy being formulated, the French and the Germans, they meet and they agree on a common position. And that will then be a very important voice that can shape the overall outcome of those negotiations. Next to this, we often have other spontaneous alliances forming, but that's subject to the respective policy issues.
Armis, we've talked a lot and enough about the internal political developments in Europe, in its different institutions. We talked about leaders, we talked about alliances and shifting alliances within the EU. But why don't we take a step back in this third block and talk about the EU as a whole in the changing world order? So let me just put the question out there. How do you see the EU playing now as an actor in the global stage?
I think it depends on both in and external factors. If there's a rise of external threats, then the EU states could be forced to move closer together because they just realize they're not able to fight back on their own. For example, if Russia attacked the EU militarily, it would also launch all kinds of hybrid attacks on EU member states. Then there would be a need to develop a common response where the EU military is moving closer together. Meanwhile, we could have internal factors that erode European power. We have all those far-right parties that are further and further rising across the Union. Also far-left parties that are skeptical of the European Union. This is related to the rise of social media and the increasing polarization of our discourses. This could lead to increased EU skepticism, and increased EU skepticism means less cooperation on an EU level, means the EU will be weakened. What do you think about all of this? And to get to a specific issue, how do you think that Russia's war in Ukraine has impacted EU cohesion? Was it this external factor that allowed the EU to move closer together?
Definitely, Armis. I think there's two leaders that we can thank for European cooperation and cohesion these last few years. And hilariously, those would be Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. When we reflect about Putin's aggression against Ukraine, combined with the perceptions of a drifting U.S. engagement in Europe, this has triggered a significant boost in defense spending, in procurement and military production in the continent. I think that all European capitals are actively trying to build more capable forces, independent both economically and militarily, to address these existential vulnerabilities. Across the episode, we've talked about the increase of their defense budgets. We talked about the different instruments that the European institutions are trying to put in place to address all of these different elements. And I think, Armis, that the most crucial element to talk about here is that for Europeans now, Ukraine and its security is now perceived as an integral element of the continent's peace and security structure. But here, Armis, I think that the divisions start to raise again when we talk about the different stances of how to address the ending of the fighting, right? We're talking in the context of negotiations. As you mentioned, we are recording before the meeting. I think that listeners will have a better perspective once this episode is out next week. But I think that there's a lot of disagreements of how to better address factors such as Ukraine's sovereignty and this wider security threat that comes from Putin. And at the same time, this U.S. perspective trying to negotiate directly with Russia, sidelining. I mean, it's true what you're mentioning. The approach that Trump has displayed these past days doesn't compare to what he would say in his campaign or in the first months of his administration. But I think that still to today, Europe navigates a really difficult relation globally and with the different actors in place. But as we've mentioned, I think that the capabilities, the continent and its states, it does have them. It's a matter of putting them in place and having that political will that we have talked about across this episode. What about you, Armis? How do you see this specific crisis that we talked in the podcast since the war started a couple of years ago?
In some ways, it has strengthened the EU for sure, because there's this increased awareness that there is a common threat that one needs to react to. On the other hand, Russia also didn't enable Europe to fully solve its deep inability to really drive geopolitics. The EU still can't formulate decisions in foreign policy without the approval of each member state. And this has been going on for so many years, and not even the huge Russia issue has changed that. It's a slight step forward, but it's not enough to become a powerful geopolitical actor. I think if Putin is further stepping up those attacks, then such thing could maybe happen, that the EU says enough is enough. Now we really need to get our stuff together. But yeah, we haven't been seeing that so far. Also, and that's such a major factor, it just needs to be mentioned. Also, because Russia has been very successful at spreading dis and misinformation across the European Union through various media organizations, through social media. And that has just been shaping the discourse tremendously. And yeah, the leaders in Europe, they just feel the public pressure not to go too far in European integration. It's the number goal of Russia towards Europe, in my opinion, that there is no European Union, because it would just be such a hard actor to fight against. It's not in Russia's interest, at least from the perspective of the current Kremlin administration, that there is a strong European Union, I think. And also on the other side of the spectrum, if Trump increases his attacks on the EU, for example, through trade measures, etc., this could increase the cohesion. But again, we've seen those attacks play out many years, and still the main structural issues have not been overcome. So let's see how the next years and months to come will play out.
Armis, as a conclusion, and I think that this idea bridges perfectly to what you just said. There was this great article that I read a couple weeks ago by Celeste A. Wallander. It's called Beware the Europe That You Wish For. And in a nutshell, it talks about how Europe's emergence as a more self-reliant and strategically independent actor is both something amazing for this broader geopolitical calculation, but at the same time, it's something that maybe the US is also should not be as happy for, as you've mentioned, right? Like it's better to have actors with enough power to deal by themselves, but maybe not to challenge your own power, right? And I think that now that Europe is stepping up and investing heavily in its own defense capabilities, trying to pursue this strategic autonomy, might question the traditional role of the US as the global security guarantor. I think it's clear that the era of unquestioned American leadership is starting to come to a close. From the Chinese side, definitely they're in the game, but I have the feeling like Europe is still in the game, as we are trying constantly in this episode to say, right? But the future of this will still hinge on delicate calibration, on more dialogue, more political will. And yeah, as Wander puts it in her article, I think that maybe the world should be careful and beware of the Europe that it's wishing for. More strong, more independent, rising. And yeah, maybe a new chapter in transatlantic relations will begin. That's how I would summarize our whole discussion today, Armis. But what about yourself?
Yes, it's a good point. From an American perspective, to see Europe being more and more independent, it could mean that it will not be able to push through its will like it has during the US-EU trade deal, and in many other instances. And also across the world. I mean, let's think of the Iran deal. where the US has unilaterally said, no, we want to cancel this deal. The EU, China, and Russia also, they were against it. They wanted to keep this deal alive, but they couldn't. The US just said so. And with the EU becoming more and more independent, it will have a stronger voice, and that will be at the expense of other actors, of course. It could also lead to a more healthy and balanced relationship between the US and EU. And that in the end could help them to counter the China-Russia issues more effectively, perhaps. But that's all in the stars. We will see. We have laid out the factors. Now it's up to our listeners to decide how it will play out. And you can rely on us to be further providing you with our analysis. And we're looking forward to reaching you in another episode soon.